Welcome in to Salt City Hoops live postcast and beer. Like I promised you, this is live postcast and beer, so you know we're gonna have this going. Normally, I got some sort of fancy Colorado beer for you, and I don't. I have Super Bowl hangover beers for you. I'm just drinking my favorite easy drinking beer, which is a Mexican Pilsner, inappropriately called a Mexican lager, but Mexican Pilsner. I love Modelo's and Pacificos. So that's all we got for you today to talk about the stupid Jazz deadline and this stupid Jazz loss. Actually, I'm pretty pro Jazz trade deadline, but I think we got to talk about the actual details for that. So this game was against the Warriors on February 12th. And we have want to make sure that we have the right channels being shared. So I really appreciate you all being in here today. Make sure that I'm sharing the right thing for people. So if you're here on YouTube, thank you for joining. I'm here to talk to you all about the trade deadline and the loss today. So I'm just trying to make sure I'm getting the right things shared for everybody. Let's get that all tweeted out. Thank you for joining, man. I'm just thrilled to be here just to get going live and talk about the deadline again. So so I got the YouTube channel open. I got playback open. So drop a comment wherever you're watching. Love to have you. See you there, Riley, on YouTube. Great to be here. Shako Mike. You're new to this, but I'm at a point where I don't see much difference between this team post-trade deadline and last year's post-trade deadline. Just not seeing the path forward for the Jazz. I think there are some differences between those two deadlines that we can certainly get to. But for now, we gotta get the graphic up on the screen here, the right one. So we're of course going to share my desktop for a minute because I didn't plan this one well at all. Is it this one? Yes, it is. All right, and then we're going to get the Warriors and Jazz box score here broadcast over so we can talk about how poorly one played. And I got cleaning the glass stats that we're going to talk about just a little bit, though, because there isn't a lot to take away from this game from a cleaning the glass standpoint. But I like to kind of look at to see how exactly did the Warriors kick our ass from sun up to sundown in this one. It wasn't just the fourth quarter, although it certainly felt like that at times. Get this out of here. All right, so we got more of a screen we can share. So let's get started. Welcome in. I've said that 3 times now, but welcome to YouTube. Welcome into Playback. I'm Mark Pereira. I got a beer here. Hopefully you do too on a Monday. I'm nursing a Super Bowl hangover. My dear 49ers lost, but that's okay because I care more about the Utah Jazz, who have much thinner championship potential than the 49ers do next year. So the Jazz are still in a more interesting spot. They got good stuff to talk about, and I'm here to do it. So the Jazz lose today by 22 at home to the Warriors without a lot of their coaching staff, who was attending the funeral of their Serbian assistant coach, who I will mispronounce his name, so I will not deign to do so because I hate mispronouncing names. But I don't want to lose the box score here. And this game was so the first game after the trade deadline, you're kind of going to look at it like, well, we're going to play some guys who haven't been in the rotation very recently. How are they going to perform? And you can kind of give them an excuse, right? You can say, well, these guys haven't really played much together. We're getting Taylor Hendricks the first minutes in a few times. They're on the road against a championship contender. Surely they're going to lose. And frankly, they showed a lot of fight in that Suns game. I actually enjoyed watching them. I thought they had some nice performances, even if they weren't terribly with it together the entire time. But this game at home was a lot more disappointing, in part because the Jazz just couldn't really get it together from some of their key contributors. Lowry Markkinen -26 today. John Collins -27. Keontae George was a -32. Do you know how hard it is to be -32 in a game? I know it was a 22-point loss, so some of that is going to be quite a bit exacerbated. But weirdly, there was a lineup that seemed to work today with it had no spacing. It was Chris Dunn, Taylor Horton Tucker, Jordan Clarkson, Taylor Hendricks, and Walker Kessler. That lineup was positive today. Taylor Horton Tucker finishes with a +6. Chris Dunn finishes with a +7. But I don't think that the plus minus necessarily tells the story of the entire game today. I think Horton Tucker in particular had a couple inexplicable decisions that just kind of identifies why his limitations as a player. He had a couple turnovers that were just just mind-boggling turnovers to watch, and that can be quite frustrating to experience. But Taylor Hendricks, he finishes a -2 in a 22-point loss, but I just thought he looked really, really, really lost out there. Defensively, he wasn't so bad, but offensively, I really didn't see the proof of concept for him. He was kind of in the way of a lot of actions, didn't really know where to be a lot of the time. Defensively, he executed some zone actions pretty decently, I thought, and he was a decent matchup defender. But there's just a chasm of space to go for him. There's going to be a lot to need to look forward to for Taylor Hendricks to give me something that I will be excited to watch more frequently. I did not enjoy watching Taylor Hendricks today. A big problem for the Jazz, though, is that marketing, it looks like he's efficient. It looks like, hey, that's 8 of 17, 3 of 7 from 3. He's really struggling early, and you frankly want Lowry Marketing to be a little bit more efficient than that. Like, that is part of what Lowry Marketing gives to you. Is not 8 of 17. That's 11 out of 17. Or he's got 0 free throws today. You need him getting 6 free throws at minimum. He should be an 8 to 10 free throw attempt per game guy. He didn't get to the line a single time. Now, I do think it was fair that Lowry Markkinen did not get the fairest whistle today, but you have to be better than the degree of difficulty of officiating. This is something I will preach time and time again. You cannot complain about officiating for the reason you lose by 22 points. Other players have to step up. Part of the officiating difficulty and the struggles for Lowry is the Warriors deployed a little bit of his own with their smaller lineups out there, led by Pajemski and Quinones. Quinones, I want to make sure I pronounce Lester Quinones' name correctly. When they're playing some of these 3-guard lineups that the Warriors were deploying with lesser talent, it's in some ways a zone is very difficult to execute masterfully, but a zone is still something that your players can get behind if they're smaller and they're still trying to learn NBA defense as far as like what are the rules on switching and communication. Communication requires chemistry and years in the league, whereas a zone defense is very rules based. If this happens, do that. And so Markkanen, you saw him get the ball at the top of the nail or in the very, very high post, and he be matched up against a guard and could not get space. I mean, we saw Stephen Curry knock him off of his pivot foot at one point. He had to give the ball up. So just a very difficult. And in the first quarter, I thought Markkanen got raked a couple times and didn't get foul calls. Holly Rowe made a good point that Markkanen is not typically a complainer, and he was giving a little bit of lip service to the officials today, which is not a very Lowry Markkanen thing to do. Maybe it was Draymond Green getting a little under his skin a little bit, but Markkanen just could not react to the physicality and didn't get the fouls, and he didn't get the free throws. And if he's not getting the fouls and the free throws, and he's only shooting less than 50% from the field, even if it's not horrible, 8 of 17, like that's Utah's engine right now. And especially if you're going to lose Kelly Olynyk, you're going to lose Simone Fontecchio. You need as much of the engine of offense as possible. I like John Collins' vision today. I thought he was passing better than I ever thought possible. I didn't mind I think 2 of his 3 turnovers I really didn't mind. But just ineffective defensively. It's hard to really believe in the future of what Collins can do if defensively he's not giving you that rangy good defense. So I loved being able to have Walker Kessler, Lowry Markkanen, and John Collins out there. together, because that is the proof of concept for the future of the Jazz, right? Um, Jake McGee coming in on playback saying, "Good evening. Hey, I know you're a Warriors fan. Would love to get your thoughts on today's game." It was quite the blowout at the end of the day. The Jazz just did not have the horses, but frankly, the Warriors don't really have a deep roster either. So it was kind of a. I think the Jazz should have been a little bit more competitive today, even if you're getting more minutes from Taylor Hendricks and Talen Horton-Tucker, taking the minutes from Kelly Olynyk and Simone Fontecchio. Did we have any other rotation players get in there today who don't normally play? No, it was just Hendricks and Horton-Tucker who got some burn today, who do not normally. So you saw more Walker Kessler minutes. Obviously, he's getting the start. He gets 4 blocks, and they rightfully credited him with a steal for an intercepted alley-oop attempt. So Walker Kessler was terrific today. 26 minutes, 2 fouls, 11 points, 9 rebounds. Talk about the 4 blocks and 2 steals, only 2 fouls. He's a plus minus of 0 in a 22-point loss. So that is just astoundingly good. 26 minutes. I was really hoping that trading Olynyk would give Hardy the incentive to say, well, our best chance of winning basketball games is if Walker Kessler is having a good game. And he does it for 30 plus minutes. I don't think Kessler has a conditioning problem. And frankly, Kessler, even after, unlike in the beginning of the season, if Kessler was having a bad moment or a bad few stretch of minutes, he would be very dejected and not really have the oomph to kick some ass, right? And today, he would get a rough foul call against him, such as when he was trying to set a little hammer screen for Keontae George. It wasn't a hammer action, but it was in the corner where he sets a screen on Steph Curry, and Keontae George gets a wide open corner 3, and Kessler didn't even shove his arm out, but he gave a nice hard arm to the face of Stephen Curry, and maybe it should have been a call, maybe not. I think that's one of those 50-50s that if it wasn't Stephen Curry and if it wasn't second-year player Walker Kessler, might go uncalled. But it's a rough call for a big man to take. Like, I'm doing everything I can possibly do out there. I'm trying to set a solid screen, and here's Stephen Curry coming in for my buddy Keontae George to shoot a 3, and you nail Stephen Curry to the ground and they whistle it. It can be very, very frustrating. But he reacted to that he had a very good fuck you attitude for the rest of the game. And it was really encouraging. Only 26 minutes. I'm sorry. This needs to be way, way higher. And I think there were a couple field goal attempts that he missed some bunnies on, whatever, but he's still 5-7 from the field. There needs to be more of an exploration for plays called for him. Actual pick and rolls. Is there a problem with what he's doing in practice that we have no confidence in his pick and roll ability? I don't know. I thought we saw some pretty good stuff last year. I know it was Mike Conley orchestrating the show. And that can make life very, very easy for a 7-foot big man. Mike Conley's played with a lot of them, including Rudy, throughout his career. But this team is not incapable of operating basic pick and rolls. Man, maybe give me some Market and Kessler 2-man game. That was actually something that worked really well at the end of last year. Was kind of exploring Markkanen's ball handling a little bit, is just to have Kessler set a nasty screen and get Markkanen just a little bit more of an advantage. That just wasn't happening today. And so I really think that we need more Kessler minutes. And I don't know if it would have swung the tide in today's game, but with Draymond Green in aggressive foul trouble in the first half, I think you got to look at Walker Kessler and say, hey, can you play the entire second quarter? Can I bring you in earlier when Draymond can't get back on the floor? Because he's got 3-4 fouls. Did he have 4 fouls in the first half? Or did he have 3 and pick up? I think he might have picked up his 4th early in the third. Of course, Draymond Green does not foul out today in 23 minutes, almost gets his own triple-double. Green had a fabulous second half. Golden State really pulled away because Utah couldn't. I mean, obviously Stephen Curry was a big factor on that. 16 of his 19 field goal attempts are from 3. That's absolutely insane. But I thought Green was quite terrific. The other Utah lineup decision that I'm really going to quibble with, I think is it the last thing we should talk about? I'll probably say some shit about Taylor Horton-Tucker and Taylor Hendricks after this, but starting Keontae George in place of Chris Dunn, I thought was a peculiar lineup decision. So you'll recall that Utah's pre-deadline starting lineup was Chris Dunn, Colin Sexton, Simone Fontecchio, Lauri Markkanen, and John Collins. And I think it's totally valid to say I need my starting lineup to have legitimate spacing. Like I need to have, if I'm going to have Walker Kessler out there in place of Simone Fontecchio, Chris Dunn is an adequate 3-point shooter, but he's not. But that's only by percentages, right? I think we quibble with percentages for 3-point shooting versus how much of a threat they are. They showed today that Draymond Green was shooting 40% from three this season, which is surprising to be sure. Like you don't think of Draymond Green being a 40% 3-point shooter, but teams are completely not guarding him anymore, right? So it's 40% on wide open attempts, and are you living with that in lieu of making sure that Stephen Curry has two guys on him all the time? You probably do. So you can't give much credence to his percentage if he's not really an actual threat for the offense. Same thing with Chris Dunn. I think he's not a non-factor, which is important to his viability to even be on the floor, right? He has to be able to shoot something, and I think he's got a good mid-range game. He's got a beautiful floater game. So there's some viability to his offense. So Hardy's saying, all right, if I'm going to start Kessler and play him alongside Markkanen and Collins, by the way, I think is equal of a threat to Chris Dunn, right? So Collins will shoot the ball more and you'll shoot more difficult attempts. But he's a pretty miserable 3-point shooter this year. He hasn't been as bad as he was in Atlanta last year, but Atlanta was really a complete cratering of his performance. Whereas this year, I think he's shooting something like 33%. Of course, every time I say that, I'm gonna have to. Anytime I drop a stat, I gotta verify. I hate just spewing stats off the mouth, but I know he's been not terrific from three. And so this all comes back to starting Keontae George, who has more ostensible range than Chris Dunn. But you're playing against Stephen Curry. Their main offensive threat is Steph Curry. And Chris Dunn is more of a matchup, kind of be in your face defender. He's way better against players who prefer driving. He's not really a chase guys around the perimeter defender, right? He doesn't have that athleticism. He's a really athletic dude. That's part of his high draft measurables, but his main defensive skill is reaction. And I think when he's kind of chasing Stephen Curry around, he gets those first couple like guesses right of like which way is Curry going to go. But as Curry starts to do more of the navigation of screens or whatever, Dunn kind of starts trailing and it has to pass him off. And we saw that a couple times today when Dunn was on him, that Dunn had to pass off the guarding of him. So I maybe Stephen Curry isn't the best Chris Dunn matchup, but Chris Dunn would have done a hell of a lot better job on Stephen Curry than Keontae George, a rookie who also had a bad attitude tonight, which isn't worth talking about. But this wasn't Keontae George's best, like, I'll fight for everybody kind of guy, right? It was not his greatest. John Collins, 34% from three this year. Yeah, 29% last year. So not nearly as bad as last year. But you would like that 34% to be way higher, especially because John Collins shot 37% 2 years ago, 40% in 2020, and 40% in 2019. So he has a better history of shooting way better than this, and 34% isn't going to get the job done. So if that's what you're dealing with, then I don't see the spacing concerns when you're with the defensive value they could have gotten out of Chris Dunn. Starting Keontae George, I think, was just a surprise to me, and I wasn't thrilled with the outcome. I want Keontae George to get more minutes. I just don't think that this is it, and I think you also needed to have more than 19 minutes for Chris Dunn. Poor shooting performance, but he finishes a +7. Part of that is that weird lineup, though. Like I can't give the plus minus a whole lot of credit when the Jazz big run in the second quarter, the reason it's the only quarter that they didn't manage to lose was because of that horrible lineup of Chris Dunn, Taylor Horton-Tucker, Jordan Clarkson, Taylor Hendricks, and Walker Kessler. Basically, the lineup says that we're not going to make any threes, and you're not either. But I think 30 minutes for Keontae George is probably about right, but he did not have a great game today, and he was a team low minus 32 because he couldn't hang defensively. Jake says, worst Kuminga game I've seen in a long time. Wish you could have seen a better showcase. He's been consistently getting sustainable points in the paint. He missed some easy shots in the paint. It was very clear that like he has confidence. He is way more athletic than anyone the Jazz could have possibly thrown out there. It's one of the Jazz's biggest weaknesses, not having Simone Fontecchio, is we don't have any 6'7", 6'8", 6'9" guys to kind of go up and match a guy like Kuminga's athleticism. And it's Kuminga's athleticism plus now his more efficient understanding of where he can get the ball and score in the paint. And I was wildly impressed with Kuminga's presence on the floor. He's only finishing 4 of 10 today, but it was a very confident 3-point shot that he had earlier and 6 free throw attempts. Like that's a good game. I really appreciated this. -4 and a 22-point win is a big problem, but and defensively I think was his bigger issue today, frankly. He was either the center or he was playing alongside Looney in some of those lineups that were getting torched by Utah, or playing alongside Dario Saric in some of those second quarter lineups of the non-shooting Utah lineups. And he had a couple balls drop off his hands. His turnovers were a little weird, but it was very clear that this guy belongs on the basketball court. And I really enjoyed watching Kuminga play. Wiggins could have had the best game of his life if he 3 of his 4 misses were fast break layup attempts that were well contested by Utah, but they're still fast break attempts that I thought Wiggins could have converted. So I thought Wiggins had a nice little comeback game. I thought his defense was pretty adequate today. And Klay Thompson struggled horribly defensively in the first half, but then he was able to just torch them offensively in the second half. And it really didn't. You start looking at these lineups, these performances from the Warriors, and you're like, yep, that all kind of clocks out. And you look at the performances from Utah, and it's like, how did that really happen? I didn't think Sexton got 22. I kind of expected seeing Markkanen having a lower output, but seeing Horton Tucker have a +6 was stunning to me because he was the worst player on the floor for a lot of it. I tweeted out his horrible turnover at the end of the first half where he's just like, Jordan Clarkson is calling for the ball wide open at the top of the arc on a fast break. This isn't when like Taylor Horton Tucker is underneath the basket and doesn't see him. Horton Tucker is driving on the fast break. So he's driving on the fast break and he just looks off Jordan Clarkson and says, I got it. And he just careens into 3 Warriors defenders and just passes a blind pass into the corner and gets an immediately turnover, which was immediately passed to Klay Thompson for end of the half or end of the quarter fast break bucket, which was just incredibly frustrating. So I tweeted that one out because I couldn't. I had to mention it. Jake asked, what did I think of Podziemski? He's been my favorite Warriors player to watch kind of all season, especially after the Warriors lost Chris Paul to the long-standing injury. I really enjoyed watching Podziemski just kind of get into people's faces defensively. He's not afraid to make difficult passes. That's frankly, I'm just seeing now that he had 4 turnovers. That kind of makes sense with how he played today. But super capable, willing 3-point shooter. Just willing to play like not a rookie, and I think that's important. And athletic tools be damned, he's not slow out there. Like, he's quick, he's making quick decisions. And sometimes if you're not going to be the fastest guy in the court, what's really going to help you is just making immediate choices. And maybe it's dribbling, right? And if you decide immediately that you are going to do something with the basketball and moving with the basketball, if you're making those decisions quickly, that will also put the defense on their heels just as much as if you are from a standstill and you have a defender right on your face and you have a quick first step like Colin Sexton. Sometimes if Podziemski was to start from a standstill, he's not going to do that Colin Sexton style blow by. No, he's got to make these decisions quickly. And he really does that, and I appreciate that. Always rebounds well for a guard. You never really see you don't really expect him to always kind of rack up the rebounds, but you look at the end of the game and his rebound rate is always astounding. You're like, I don't remember him getting 9 rebounds, but he did. And today he only played 25 minutes and he's grabbing 4 rebounds. I like seeing him today. I'm just surprised that Jackson Davis doesn't get more burn every time we see Jackson Davis on the floor. For me, I've really enjoyed watching his performances as a player, and when he was getting more burn, he was putting up amazing stat lines, especially for fantasy basketball purposes. And I know he's got a very unusual physical profile. Think he's deserving of more actual minutes, especially as Looney becomes completely ineffective. And I just think it's time for Kuminga and Jackson Davis and Podziemski to get more burn. In lieu of somebody like Dario Saric, who just looks like it's ready for him to have his European post-NBA career already. Saric does not look he doesn't look ready to play basketball anymore, frankly. I want Gooey is it Gooey or Jewy? I want Santos to get more. I really like watching him in the G League. He's been fun. And Gary Payton was the Warriors' leading scorer for a minute. The Warriors were very leaky today. The Warriors were immediately running back to get quick little cherry picking buckets. Peyton was a benefit of a few of those. I mentioned Wiggins missing a couple of those that he should have had, but great, frankly, Jazz fast break defense was useful. What was the I'm curious about the fast break stats. This is the cleaning the glass for today. The transition. Look at this, right? So 24% of Warriors possessions started out in transition. Now they scored like shit in transition, and you expect that to be way higher. That's a very atrocious rate of conversion on those. And so the points per transition player is not very great, but like being in transition is going to be very, very, very tiring for the defense. And if you then follow up with this much transition play, it's going to tire out the defense, so that when you get into static offensive sets, the defense can't keep up with Steph Curry's of the world, right? So he's getting more open looks because the Jazz are frequently having to defend in transition. There's some wild transition stats here that they were able to get plenty of steals but couldn't score off of them. That's you really don't see this sort of like if you're getting steals, which the Warriors had plenty, and the Jazz turned it over a lot today, that the Warriors are getting off in transition from a decent amount of steals and then just can't convert them all. That's pretty unusual coming from the Warriors today. But the Jazz are going to turn it over, 20 times today? 17, not great. Their turnover rate was what? Yeah, 17% turnover rate. That's very poor. You want to have Frankie, I was going to say 12%, and that's exactly where the Warriors were today. A nice turnover percentage for the Warriors today. Warriors didn't have an amazing game, right? This was a B+ game for the Warriors. Jazz played about a D-, and that's how you get a 20-point loss at home. Talk about the trade deadline. We did do a quote-unquote normal podcast for Salt City Hoops. So if you want to check that out, please do. On the trade deadline, did that with Ken Clayton and Dan Clayton. I just checked my YouTube. I don't know why the video quality is so poor on the screen, but hopefully you're enjoying it. Enjoying the audio. But so I mentioned the trade deadline on the full podcast with Ken and Dan Clayton. We went over a little bit brief on our thoughts about Simone Fontecchio, Kelly Olynyk, and Ochai Agbaji, but we spent a big portion of that talking about what's next for Utah. What is going to happen for the rest of the season? Are they tanking? Are they not tanking? They owe their top 10 protected pick to Oklahoma City. They keep it if it's inside the top 10. So does that mean they're going to tank to try to keep that pick, or are they going to try to give it up? And I think fans they're rightfully skeptical of Justin Zanuck, the general manager, when he says, we don't really care. We don't really care about wins or losses. We just want to have competitive basketball on the floor so that guys like Keontae George and Taylor Hendricks are getting put in an actual learning environment um, instead of just playing for a tanking team. And unlike last year, I should take a sip of beer before I get into this. I'm going to get angry. So last year, two things were different about the trade deadline last year. And this is something that Shotgun Mike was kind of asking earlier, is what's the difference between last year's deadline and this year's deadline? So last year's deadline, you trade Mike Conley, who is the offensive engine for everything that the Jazz do, and they had no real backup point guard except for Colin Sexton, who even to this day is not all that efficient of like a playmaker and a setup man. And you also had your eyes towards possibly stealing a Victor Wembanyama. So Jake, thanks for joining, man. Have a great night. Now, the Jazz won probably like 4 or 5 games more than they intended, playing the horrible lineups that they played at the end of last year. We had the Kelly Olynyk banked 3 game that was awfully surprising, for example, and they could have easily been in the 6th, 7th in the lottery odds, and they ended up 9th and couldn't have that downward trajectory and maybe stealing. And not just Victor Wembanyama, but we also thought Scoot Henderson was a can't-miss prospect. Brandon Miller would have been amazing to get in the top 3. Maybe Amen Thompson in the top 3. So there were a lot of reasons to maybe try to think, well, after we make these deadline moves for good assets, should we just completely tank down to the bottom? And last year, the pick was not conveyable to Oklahoma City. So it was really just about like, hey, how bad can our draft pick get? You also had real injuries by Jordan Clarkson and Lauri Markkanen last year. And Lauri Markkanen is dealing with a little bit of a shoulder thing, but this team does look healthy, especially as we get out of the All-Star break. We'll see how healthy they end up being. So there was a real weight, a sinker on the team that really drew their record down last year. If you're not having Mike Conley or any sort of setup man, and you're playing not just young players, but like bad players like Damian Jones and Juan Toscano Anderson, like guys who are not in the NBA anymore. Well, I think Damian Jones is a 3rd or 4th string center for, I think, Cleveland maybe. I don't know who Damian Jones plays for. Please sue me. But I know Damian Jones is on a roster somewhere at least. This is going to kill me. Who's Damian Jones play for? Cleveland. I nailed it. Look at that. All right. Damian Jones plays for Cleveland. All right. You don't have to sue me anymore. But there weren't any young players kind of looking forward to. It was just kind of players that you knew were below replacement level. And maybe going for the idea of trying to steal one of the high draft picks. This year is a lot different. So the Jazz didn't start out the season with a Mike Conley, like good classic point guard on the roster, but we did find at the end of last year that Chris Dunn could do some things. We kept him around. Colin Sexton improving a little bit. Keontae George, not a pure point guard, but we found out that he can do some real point guard things. And Jordan Clarkson really improved his passing and playmaking last year. So you walk into this year with those 4 ball handlers as primary dribbling action guys, and Kelly Olynyk, who we'll get to, of course. Kelly Olynyk, the best passer for his position on the team by far. Those 4 ball handlers are great, but they're not the passer that Kelly Olynyk is. But those guys are still the guys who are initiating a lot of the actions. You need these guys who can dribble and shake guys off and make things happen. And that's not exactly Kelly Olynyk's game either. So even if you don't have a Mike Conley type, by not losing any of those 4 guys, you're not losing any of the players who you would normally expect to kind of orchestrate the offense, right? The corporate knowledge, that, as you will, that some of these teams refer to as like, hey, this is how a set looks. This is how our defense looks. This is how we get into our actions. We're not losing any of those ball handlers like we did last year where we lost Mike Conley and Nickeil Alexander-Walker, by the way. So you're putting the ball in the hands of a guy like Chris Dunn, who we liked having around, but was still having to learn Utah basketball. You're putting the ball in Talen Horton-Tucker's hands, which that comes with its litany of its own problems. And this year, I think there isn't that weight that's going to sink the team because they still have that corporate knowledge of dribbling players at the 1 and the 2 who will keep the offense afloat for the most part. Now, passing will take a hit with the loss of Kelly Olynyk, that's for sure. But I don't think Kelly Olynyk is exactly a player that you look at him and say that guy's adding 4 wins to our team. Like he might affect, like on average, maybe 1, maybe 2 wins for the rest of the year. Maybe. I think it's probably going to be. It could be the fact that he affects 0 wins by the end of the year. He was miserable today against San Antonio. I know it's only his second game there, but if we look over to what he did against San Antonio, Wembanyama triple-double with blocks, by the way. But I think he was something like a minus 30. Yeah, minus 20 in 21 minutes. Decent little stat line with 3 steals, but he was not one of the drivers towards the Toronto loss here. It did not help them with victory. Just look at this lineup real quick, though, by the way. 27 points, 14 rebounds, 5 assists, 10 blocks. Almost a quadruple double with turnovers. How about that? I love this post-deadline Spurs, by the way. Getting I like how they look as a team. And I'll be interested to tune into more of them. 0 assists for Jeremy Sohan. I really don't understand how the point guard thing happened over there. Anyways, the deadline this year, so you're not losing any of your real ball handlers. I think you're losing a little bit of spacing, losing a little bit of passing skill with Simone and winning as much as a Mike Conley did last year. So I do believe Justin Zanuck when he says, look, we're not bad enough to just be total shit. Like, we cannot crater to the first or second pick. Like, Lauri Markkanen is too good. And you can't go to Lauri Markkanen game 3 of the regular season and say, hey, we're only going to play you like 38 games this year, even if you're healthy, because we want a good draft pick. No, you're going to play just with what you got. And Utah took the Olynyk and Fontecchio clubs out of Hardy's bag, if you will, to give Taylor Hendricks more burn. And Taylor Hendricks looked like shit tonight. We'll see how he performs later. But 18 minutes of Taylor Hendricks isn't going to kill you as a basketball team. It's really going to be driven by, is Lauri Markkanen a top 15 player? Is he a top 20 player? Is Walker Kessler going to get 30 minutes a game plus? The answer so far is no on the second question, at least. And those are going to be your drivers to winning. These are the high-impact players. Is Colin Sexton playing like an amazing point guard? Is he playing like a replacement level point guard? So far, replacement level. That's not going to help winning. But if he's playing amazing, that could add 4 or 5 wins that you wouldn't otherwise get over the course of a regular season. That's the type of player that you want looking for. And the Jazz are not necessarily in talent acquisition or asset acquisition mode right now. They're really on a fact-finding mission. I think that's a little different for a rebuilding team. Now, if Lauri Markkanen was the same player that we thought in Chicago and Cleveland, if that's who he was, maybe we would be just, basement taking as much as possible so that we can get high asset accumulation. But with Markkanen immediately being cool, all-star Lauri Markkanen completely threw a wrench in all the plans, because now you have this middle-of-the-road team that you didn't expect with all these assets. I'm like, what do you do with that? Do you try to immediately contend and see who's available and trade 4 first-round draft picks for a DeJounte Murray, even though that's a wild overpay? Do you try to get into contention right now with those good players? Or do you wait for the bigger fish later on so that you're building an actual championship team rather than an okay playoff team? And I think that's what they're looking for. They're looking for those bigger swings. And by acquiring a high second-round draft pick and a late first-round draft pick in this year's draft, they're able to add more of those assets that can build on other things. I would not be surprised if we traded this year's late first-round draft pick for like 3 second-round picks. I know that's going to be disappointing for a lot of people to hear. That Kelly Olynyk and Ochai Agbaji was traded for 3 second-round picks, but I would not be surprised for that to be the end state. Taking a beverage break. I gotta drink this beer that I say that I ostensibly have. Trying to think about where to go next on the trade deadline. We can talk about Abaji, Olenek. I think I want to talk about the mechanics more about why we're trading these guys at the time we are. And I certainly want to talk about the return and why I think the return that we got for those guys is pretty damn good. I want to talk about the draft this upcoming year and how it's a shitty draft, right? And what that actually means, though, for late first round picks and early second round picks. Yeah, I think that's a fair point to be. So hopefully you have a beverage with me on Salt City Hoops Live Postcast and Beer. There's something about a Mexican Pilsner that can just really help you out with getting your voice back. So the return. Let's break these down into the two trades that they actually are. So Simone Fontecchio, first, I think we have to talk about the disposition of these players. Like, what are they going to be on the next Jazz team? What we should be focusing on is the Jazz as a future championship team. What are they going to mean towards the Lowry Markkanen future? Like, if he's our championship piece, what are we building around him? And Simone Fontecchio is going to be a restricted free agent this summer. He's 28 years old. 28 years old, right? 3 more years of real high-level basketball, right? Just picture it in your mind. You can see Fontecchio on like a championship level team coming off the bench for 12 minutes, hitting a couple good threes and then going to the bench, right? Like a Matt Bonner type or something. Shot horribly from 3 last year, shot very well from 3 this year. So that was kind of why we brought him over, is to be this big wing who is a rugged defender and can shoot threes well. I think if he did this last year, we would be thinking about Fontecchio way, way differently. But he had a very struggling first year, couldn't get off the bench, and then he comes to this year, and then all of a sudden he's starting. So we have this attachment to like his growth and development, but he's not a 23-year-old restricted free agent. He's a 28-year-old restricted free agent. And Fontecchio is going to command, due to his play, $11, $12, $15 million a year from these teams. David Locke, who isn't gospel, but he makes some salient points from time to time. He mentioned on his podcast that if a team is willing, who has cap space, like Detroit, if they have an upcoming summer with cap space, if they make a trade for a player who is a pending restricted free agent, all signs point to that they were willing to make an offer sheet for that player in the first instance. Maybe in a sign and trade also situation, like a Grant Williams type situation where he was a sign and trade from Boston to Dallas as a restricted free agent. So there is interest in Fontecchio as a free agent, $11, $12, $15 million a year. I don't want to be paying Fontecchio $15 million a year. I don't think he's worth it, nor if we do that, that ties up what we can do with other players. For example, Lowry Markkanen's renegotiation and extension. So Markkanen this summer, we can pay him up to I can pay him up to a max contract this summer with cap space for a renegotiation and extension. Bump up, so he's slated to make like $15 million next year. You bump him up to $30 million or $35 million. I'm not sure what the maximum you could do for that, but let's say you bump him up to $30 million and then say you're going to then you can then extend him after that up to his max on the extension. So by giving him that money up front, you can only do that if you have cap space. So all the cap space that you use to do things like signing a Simone Fontecchio and his restricted free agency lessens the impact that you can do on that renegotiation and extension. Maybe it's not Fontecchio. Maybe you're trying to bring in other pieces to kind of improve the quality of this team that have a longer tail that can that jives well with Markkanen's future. Whereas Fontecchio, 20 years old and a very niche skill set, does he have what you need there? So I think Fontecchio is worth keeping around. Like, he definitely fits this team. He fits well with Markkanen. He started for a reason. Um, but if you're telling me that you can get an early second round pick, like this is going to be the 31st, 32nd, or 33rd pick in this upcoming draft, it might be the 31st pick in the draft for it a seventh or eighth best guy, right? Like Fontecchio, yes, he was starting, but in the pecking order of Jazz players who are good, he's probably like their eighth best player. And you're saying you can get the 31st overall pick for that? That's outstanding. And if you're thinking they're saying like, okay, that pick doesn't really mean much. This draft is shitty. Like, what is the point of having such a draft pick? That doesn't seem like great value. We're going to talk about what I think about the NBA draft in a moment, but don't forget about the new collective bargaining agreement rules for expensive teams when it comes to second round draft picks. So now teams who are in the luxury tax, either over the first apron or over the brand new second apron, they have limitations on what they can do with their team. They have a bit more restrictions on how they can acquire players in trades or free agency and that sort of thing. The tax penalties are harsher. So there are very few conduits for them to be able to acquire players. But one thing that was added in exchange for that was a new second round pick exception. So before, if you wanted to give your second round picks any sort of extra juice on their salary, that had to come out of your exceptions that you had, or cap space. So if let's say you're a really expensive team like the Clippers or the Celtics, and you are paying a buttload of tax money, and you are restricted on what players you can acquire via your taxpayer mid-level exception, which is a lower amount than your standard mid-level exception. You still have a second round pick exception that is brand new, where you can offer X amount of money to second round draft picks that they don't count against they count against the cap, but you're allowed to give money to those players over and above what you could in the past. I'm giving this poor explanation to say that the 31st pick in the draft is suddenly way more valuable to the teams like the Clippers and the Celtics than they ever were before. This is a really, really important asset. Either the players who are available at 31 are pretty good, and actually there's a long history of early second round picks being viable rotation players. Late first, early second round picks. There's a lot of really good rotation players available at these times. Um, Not a whole bunch of stars, but definitely like guys who have 8 to 10 year careers. Guys like who are as good as Simone Fontecchio, only they're 19 years old right now, or 20 years old, right? Like they will be Simone Fontecchio when they're 22 years old versus when they're 28, right? You're making that young play, or you can trade this is an extremely valuable pick to a team like the Clippers or the Celtics that have no real ways to supplement their very expensive limited roster. So you trade that pick you could trade that for a protected first round pick a couple years from now. Say like, hey, you need to add a real player to your team right now. Here's the 31st overall pick. Give us your first 2 years from now. That's a very viable trade. That is on the table. And trading a guy like Fontecchio, who's fine for that, is a slam dunk win. And I'm just stunned at anyone who says that was a poor trade for Utah because of the quality of player that Fontecchio is. Fontecchio is just a guy, and as limited as the Jazz were at 6'7", 6'8", 6'9", guys who can defend and shoot. Those guys are rare in the NBA overall, and I think having him around is a very good thing. But if he had a couple years left on his contract, I'd say this is crazy. Like, we should really keep him around this marketing lineup so that we can build marketing skill sets so that we can convince marketing we're trying to win. But he's going to be a free agent, and we probably weren't going to bring him back anyways. So if you're not going to bring him back a guy anyways, like, get something for him. Don't be like Toronto with Fred VanVleet. Get something for him. The Jazz got a really good asset, in my opinion, that either will draft a useful rotation player that we can be excited about, or we can trade it to a team like the Celtics or the Clippers who really have no other ways to add talent. And they'll pay a premium to do so, I guarantee you, because their championship window is thin. It's real thin. It's razor sharp thin in the Clippers case. So the management team for them, they're incentivized to do whatever they can to pull it off. We'll see. In Ochai and Olynyk, speaking of Toronto, I think that trade has to rightfully be thought of as two separate trades. Oh, by the way, we get Gabriele Procida in the Fontecchio trade, who was a second-round draft pick 2 years ago. Doesn't look great in Europe. We'll see what happens, but he was an early second. He was a 36 overall pick 2 years ago. Speaking of early second-round picks, we'll see if he comes over. He's 6'7", 6'8", rangy, ostensibly a shooter, but hasn't shot well this year, and is a pretty solid defender. So we'll see if he comes over. But we have the rights to him now, so that's kind of a nice little sweetener. So, Olynyk and Agbaji. I've said you kind of got to think of it as two separate trades. Let me first say that purely on value alone, how much is this guy worth in gold bars? How much is the draft pick worth in gold bars? And just putting him on weight, I think the Jazz lost the trade from a pure value perspective. Like, just straight up, if you're trading red paper clips for, doing the red paper clip story about just trading red paper clips for a little bit more, all of a sudden you end up with a brand new car. I don't think the Jazz necessarily won on like a value perspective, but I don't think it was that far off. The hope was that a guy like Kelly Olynyk could be traded to a contending team this year. Say like, hey, he's an expiring contract. You might not be able. You'll get his bird rights if you want to re-sign him this summer. Even if you're over the salary cap, re-sign Kelly Olynyk, kind of keep your contending window a little bit open with a useful bench player, and give us a late first-round pick or a protected first-round pick. I think that's the hope. You're hoping to get a bad first-round pick for Kelly Olynyk. That's your hope going in. And by all accounts, Utah was willing to not trade Kelly Olynyk if that late first-round pick came attached to incoming salary. That was a point that was made to say, look, we'll trade Olynyk for your late first-round pick, but we're not going to have salary on our books for 3 more years, because that salary on the books for 3 more years hinders our capability to be flexible with our team and how we can build around Lauri Markkanen. It is not good value for us to take on that long-term money. It's really not. We'd rather just keep Kelly Olynyk and keep this good vibes going. So no, we're not going to trade him to you, Golden State, for a late first-round pick, or 3 second-round picks, or 4 second-round picks, or whatever. Remember last year we had 5 second-round picks being traded for Sadiq Bey, was it? 5 second-round picks. Like, we're not going to trade him for like that sort of value prop if you're going to also send us shit salary that we got to deal with. And shit salary in a position of Utah is really problematic. You need to be very delicate with how you build up like this great team, because unless your rookies that you draft are knocking it out of the park, right? Like the Warriors building situation, you have to make sure that when you get around to trading your draft pick assets that you got from the Gobert and Mitchell trade, and you turn around and trade for another star, that you have a competent salary structure so that you're not having to give up guys because you can't keep them because you're over the cap. You have a roster crunch or a salary crunch. So taking on long-term salary to take on your first-round pick, that's something that truly bottom-dwelling teams should be doing. They're like, hey, we're not going to contend for 3 years. So yeah, we'll take on your shitty salary for 3 years. Utah could be contending a lot sooner than that, right? Like, because Markkanen is that good in their salaries, their cap sheet is clean for the next few years. So if Golden State comes in and says, we're going to trade you 4 second-round picks or a late first-round pick for Kelly Olynyk, but you got to take on this bad salary, that's a bad deal. That's a bad deal for Utah. So Utah was willing to walk away. And then this conversation with Toronto gets really weird and interesting, where they say, we'll give you a first-round pick, and it's going to be a bad first-round pick, and it's going to be this year's first-round pick in a bad draft. But you got to give us Ochai Agbaji. And so you're thinking, okay, what is harder to swallow to get that late first round pick? Is it easier if you're Utah to take on bad salary over the next 3 or 4 years for that late first round pick? Or is it easier for you to say, okay, my second year rookie in Ochai Agbaji, who wasn't drafted by Utah, and who knows how much Utah's brass actually believes in him as a talent? Like at the draft, who knows if Utah was just kind of looking at him kind of negatively as a draft asset? But he was okay last year. He was okay this year. He projects to be an okay guy over the next 2 to 8 years, right? I don't think there's any star potential in Agbaji. We've seen nothing indicating that this 4-year college player is going to become a star. He kind of caps out as maybe a useful starter, maybe a useful starter. A useful starter you play 20 to 25 minutes, right? Like an okay player. Is it harder for Utah to take on bad salary for 3 years or give up on Ochai Agbaji? How you decide this trade for Utah depends on whether you believe in Agbaji or not. You can kind of tell by the tenor of my voice that I don't believe in Agbaji. I don't think he's going to suddenly become this player that you're going to regret trading. I mean, he's going to have great moments. I think he's going to be in the league for a long time. I think it's pretty clear that he is going to be in the league for a while doing Agbaji things, defending okay, shooting okay from three. Keep in mind, he was a bad matchup defender this year, and he was a bad three-point shooter this year. Agbaji's great defensive plays have come on weak side blocks or chase down blocks. He hasn't been able to stick with great offensive talents on like a one-on-one basis. He can't hang with people. He's a big reason that the defense is so bad, and the reason that the Jazz have to resort to playing zone defense a lot is because Agbaji you can't just stick him on somebody. And sure, he's got a lot to learn, but he's also already 24. He's a 4-year college player. You want him to have a little bit more polish coming in. You certainly want him to shoot better if he's going to be this developed in his performance. He's athletically gifted, but he's not a fuck you athlete. He's a really good athlete. And it sucks to have to lose Agbaji to get that late first round pick. But I think losing Agbaji is better than taking on bad salary for the next 3 years. And so that's what we're able to get for Kelly Olynyk is you get the first round pick, but you had to give up an okay guy to do it. Like when Agbaji hits restricted free agency in a couple years, do you really want to pay him $15 million? I don't want to pay Agbaji $15 million a year to play 18 minutes a game being okay. No, let it be Toronto's problem. If you know he doesn't have the potential to be that good of a player now, get rid of him. Do something else. It reminds me of when Utah held on to Rodney Hood too long. Rodney Hood in his second year was averaging something like 14, 15 points a game on horrible shooting splits, but it was fun watching Rodney Hood play basketball. He was, he had great, amazing, big moments as a player. Certainly as a second-year player, he had some great game-winning plays. But he was like a 40% shooter. There was a lot around Rodney Hood that said, love the, just like Agbaji, you love the guy and you love like kind of who he is as a person and as a basketball player, but you just didn't see like, Rodney Hood's going to be a great starter. It didn't feel like that. Utah held on for Rodney Hood way too long and couldn't get it. Like he ended up being a throw-in salary match for a trade instead of a useful player. And this is Utah's way of saying, like, we're going to give up on Agbaji a little sooner so that we can start the cycle over again with a late first-round pick. We're running long here on the postcast, so let me take a sip of beer and just give one last thought on the NBA draft coming up. A lot of folks have said, why are we acquiring draft picks in a year when the 2024 NBA draft is supposed to be pure garbage? Whenever the media is coming out and doing their draft pick reporting and saying, or their prospect reporting and saying, well, this draft doesn't look very good. They're exclusively talking about the lottery. 99.9 times out of 1,000, right? Or 99.9% of the time. Math is great. They're referring to the lottery prospects. They're not looking at it saying, hey, this draft is bad all the way to pick 52. No, they're saying that, look, there's the blue chip prospects at the top of the draft. They're feeling more Anthony Bennett than they are feeling Victor Wembanyama. They're feeling kind of maybe-ish. But they're not referring to the quality of player that is available at the end of the first round, early second round. And in fact, if you look at the history of quote unquote bad drafts, there's a lot of value at the end of first round, early second round that is just as good as the seasons where you have good picks at the top of the lottery. Like if the lottery is full of amazing players, that doesn't necessarily mean that the players at the end of the first round are better, right? It just means that the best available players are that much better. It doesn't mean anything about the quality player that's available at the end of the first round. The NBA draft and the players available, it oscillates from year to year. Like, okay, how many players are in certain bands, right? Like there's always going to be the same 60 players, the same 60 picks. And there are tiers of players in every draft. And some of these tiers in certain drafts have 10 blue chip guys that are like, this guy would be a number 3 overall pick in any draft. Like he is that good. He's going to be amazing. And some drafts have one guy like that or 0 guys like that. And the bands are the same for all the tiers. So you could have a draft where we got 30 guys who could be drafted between 10 and 50, and they all kind of blend together, and it's kind of hard for us to differentiate between them. And sometimes you're able to break that down and say, like, hey, we got 20 guys that are available between 20 and 30 that, like, they all kind of fit the same mold of a type of prospect. So it totally oscillates and changes from year to year. So just because all you hear about this upcoming draft is that it's total garbage at the top, which could very well be true. I don't know. I'm going to trust them on that. I'm going to assume that the media is being correct about the prospect reporting so far, that the top of the draft looks kind of like shit, and then you don't really want any of those players. Or you do. I mean, some of them are going to be great, like the Anthony Bennett trade or the Anthony Bennett draft still netted some amazing players in that draft. Giannis was drafted in the lottery for the Anthony Bennett draft. And even if you're not getting blue chip players, they're very useful players were drafted in that draft, like Oladipo and Aaron Gordon. I think Aaron Gordon was the Anthony Bennett draft. But that doesn't ever extend so far as to say, and the 25th pick in the draft, that is also going to be garbage. The 31st pick in the NBA draft, that's also going to be garbage. It's really just talking about what blue chip talent is available, and that doesn't necessarily pervade down to the end of the first round. So just because we have these picks in a bad draft does not mean that there are going to be exclusively bad players available. The Anthony Bennett draft, the quote-unquote bad draft, where nobody's worth taking at their draft pick. I mentioned Giannis. 27th pick in that year's draft was Rudy Gobert. This has been the Salt City Hoops live postcast and beer. I'm Mark. Great to have you on. Not a lot of comments in the chat today to talk about Jazz basketball on the trade deadline, but I just wanted to get my thoughts out there on the trade deadline. Note that we do have the I gave my trade deadline thoughts with Ken and Dan Clayton on a podcast that is on YouTube, and we will be releasing it on your podcast feeds shortly. So you can get a few more thoughts on that. There's a little bit more talk about what the end of the season looks like for Utah. But that's it for tonight. I've been on for a while, having a beer with you, and till the next game, we'll do this again. I really appreciate you being on, and till then, this has been Mark with the Salt City Hoops live postcast and beer. Have a good night.